welcome everybody to our session this afternoon, or may still be morning, depending on where you are. I just want to give a little bit of background before we start about who we are. We are the LS-PAC Models Center, and that's a very long acronym, but essentially we are a Lewis Stokes Regional Center of Excellence. We're funded by the National Science Foundation, and we're dedicated to preparing historically underrepresented scholars in STEM for academic careers. And through this program, we serve undergraduate students, graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and even early career faculty who are in the first 4 years of a faculty position. We have mentoring opportunities, networking opportunities, and professional development opportunities like this session today. To that point, for our mentoring and networking, we have an app that we have just launched that is in the beta phase. It's called LS-Impact. And on the app, people can create a profile. They can search for compatible mentors or mentees. And if you're a mentee on the app, you can request mentors, you can send messages, there's posts, you can follow people. So we view this as a great networking platform for historically underrepresented scholars in STEM to find mentors, to find peers. And so we encourage you all, if you haven't checked out our website, you can get involved by following the link in that I'm going to put in the chat. So I'm going to put it in here right now. So our website is lspacmodels.org, and you can follow this to our Get Involved page to see how you can get involved. And then finally, I do just want to plug our upcoming event, which is coming up in 2 weeks on December 3rd. This will be a panel. We have a great panel of folks who are going to talk about success strategies for folks who are thinking about or already are parents in academia, and how to balance your work and your home life, if you're a parent or if you're thinking about becoming a parent. I think this will be an incredible session. So we're really excited about that. And I will also put the registration link in the chat, so you can go ahead and register for that if you're interested. So I am going to go ahead and turn it over to our speaker today, Dr. Zakiya Wilson-Kennedy. She is the Assistant Dean for Diversity and Inclusion for the LSU College of Science. She has many talents. She's a great writer. She is a huge champion for diversity in STEM, and we're very grateful to have her with us this afternoon. So Dr. Wilson-Kennedy, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction and for getting us started with this session on today. Do you see my slides well? Awesome, awesome, awesome. So in addition to some of the things that Rob just shared with you, I also serve as a co-PI on the PAC Models project, which is sponsoring today's workshop. We're really excited to have you all here with us, that this section has been so richly and warmly received. During the session, we'll focus on strategies to write memorable diversity statements, learning how to highlight your past experiences, think critically about how to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in your new positions that you aspire to attain, and perhaps even currently do have that you've already secured, and how to avoid common pitfalls that candidates make when talking about their commitments to diversity. All right, so anyone that's done a session with me knows that I tend to ask for feedback. We do active things in our sessions. In this first active portion, I'm asking you all to go to slido.com to share a little bit about yourselves. We don't have time to do introductions for everyone in this space, but in this way, we'll be able to have some idea of some of the representation of disciplines in the room today in our virtual space. So you can use a device to, with the camera function, to highlight the QR code to navigate to the Slido website, or you can open up a browser and type in slido.com and then that key code 353976. And so we see that we have 16 respondents already. Material science and chemistry right now seems to be the bulk of the folks, but that's changing rapidly as you all share your disciplines with us. And so I'll give you a couple more seconds. I think we had about 54 individuals in the space, and we'll give you all a little bit of time to access the site to share your disciplines. Now, while you all are doing that, I want to share that we initially targeted this talk for postdocs, particularly individuals who were looking for faculty positions. It's my understanding that we have a much more diverse group of individuals in our session today. As of Wednesday, we had 110 registrations with over almost 60 postdocs, with 25 faculty and staff members, 21 students, 4 undergrads, and 3 who did not fit into those categories. So we know we have a really diverse group here. Um, I think that there's a lot that um, will be applicable, ways in which the content that we will share will translate to diversity for developing diversity statements for a variety of contexts. But I do want to make sure you all are aware that we initially targeted this for folks who were looking for faculty positions and or in aspiring to a faculty role. And so there's a little bit of a bias in the content because of that. Awesome. So we see we have a lot of physics individuals who are in physics, public health, chemistry, education, psychology, cell biology, biology. Gosh, a variety of different disciplines. Thank you so much for sharing. This gives us all an opportunity to have some idea of who's in the room on today. All right. So you all are here to learn more about diversity statements. And I want to start off with this synopsis of diversity statements, particularly the purpose of these. Because so many different institutions are requesting these for as components of applications, you'll see a variety of instructions for the development of these statements and specifically what they're asking for. But there is a grounding purpose for many of these, for almost all of these. Hiring committees and managers want to understand how you will enhance or advance diversity in your role and within their units. They want to understand your skills, your experience, your expertise, and how that can be leveraged to enhance the diversity in their units. They want to know more about your willingness to learn and engage in these efforts. And so this statement is really meant to understand more about your experience and your intentions for engaging in this kind of work within their units if you were hired. All right, so if you all were in the Slido before, um, it's the same one. The next question that pops up is what makes for a memorable diversity statement? And for this, I'd like for you all to just provide some of your initial concepts, some of your initial ideas of when you heard that term memorable statements, memorable diversity statements. What came to mind and what are you thinking right now are some of the things that would make for a memorable statement? And you all can do multiple responses if needed. So I'm seeing a track record of increasing diversity, personal experience, being specific, that commitment, the initiatives that you've already been involved in. What is your personal narrative? Authenticity, the stories where concepts are applied, timeless experiences. That's a very interesting one to think about. Experience with mentoring underrepresented students, anecdotes, impact, concrete examples, past committee experiences, diversity training, an explanation of how you're measuring your success. That's awesome. recognition of barriers, working with others, um, projects that you initiated that have a diversity approach, record of commitment, and understanding, knowledge and understanding of how diversity can be tangibly beneficial. I think all of these are relevant and very impactful components that can make for a memorable diversity statement. I'll give you all an opportunity to continue to add some of your thoughts there. You'll be able to see some of these, and I'll perhaps share some of these responses with Rob to share with the larger group of participants post this time. But in the interest of time, we're going to move forward right now because I think you all capture some really key ideas that I think do make for memorable diversity statements. When I summarize these, I have six major buckets to think through, and you'll see some similarities between these buckets and some of the responses that you all have already shared. The first one is connection with your personal values. You know, what are your values related to diversity, equity, and inclusion? What is your understanding of some of the common challenges with diversity and equity, particularly within the higher education landscape? Several are well established in the literature, and your diversity statement should be informed by the literature and evidence showing that you've spent some time seeking to understand an important topic in higher education and in many of our disciplines. For those in academic spaces, it should integrate approaches and strategies that are directly applicable to faculty work, which means you should be thinking about DEI in the context of your research, your teaching, and your service. The statement should have concrete and action oriented strategies that can be tailored to the institutional context to which you are writing. Noting that the context for a public land grant institution would be different than the context of a small private liberal arts college. The institutional missions are different. And so your statement should definitely be responsive to institutional missions and aligned with your experience and your vision for how you would contribute to these efforts. So a lot of this seems a little daunting, but we're going to walk through some steps to think about how these elements can be addressed as you prepare to write memorable diversity statements. All right. So here's some questions to reflect on as you're building out your diversity statement. When you say diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, respect, what do those terms mean to you? What is your working definition? And how does this dovetail with common understandings of these terms? This is more than just sharing a textbook definition of these terms, but instead focuses on how you've operationalized these terms in your work and in your leadership. All right, so is diversity important to you in your work within research and professional spaces, within your classroom spaces and other cases? If so, why? That should be a component of your diversity statement. What elements of your own identity inform your work to include teaching, research, service, scholarship, all of these things in a very tangible way? Are these things that you've thought about? Are these things that you've had the privilege that you haven't have to think about? And then how does that inform where you are right now and your commitment going forward to addressing these elements? What is your understanding of how inequities impact higher education? Um, and how does that understanding inform your teaching, research, scholarship, and service? Do you understand the university's diversity goals as outlined often in strategic plans and in other documents that are distributed, disseminated, usually on a campus's academic affairs website or other kinds of venues? What would you like to do in future departments related to diversity, equity, and inclusion? How would you ensure that your spaces of leadership in, say, your classrooms, your research labs, et cetera, are inclusive and a welcoming environments to all individuals, especially those from minoritized or marginalized groups. How has thinking about diversity actively influenced your teaching, research, mentoring, and service? What role do you believe that advising and mentoring play in working with diverse populations? And what inclusive approaches will you adopt for your mentoring practice? Are these approaches ones that you found in the literature? Are these ones that you developed through experience? And how did you come to those? And in STEM disciplines in particular, how are these elements represented in the broader impacts of your scholarship, teaching, and service? How are you leveraging this for the work that you may do with external funding agencies? How are all of these things really integrated in a comprehensive kind of way? So, one of the things I wanted to share with you all is a set of images that you very well may have seen before and or seen in different contexts before. Um, I have this first image up, and what I'm going to ask is for those of you who are actively listening, if you would type into the chat box some of the things that you notice about this first image that I'm just depicting here. So I see a response. All the people are the same. Equality, but not equity, but inequity. Each person is the same, but they have different access. Unequal reach for apples. Same height, but different distances to goals. Not everyone can reach the apple. Okay, those are key things I wanted you all to see with that first picture. Here's the second one. What are some of the things you see with this second picture? So we're seeing equity. Everyone has access to the apples. Some people need different amounts of support. Same access, but different resource needs. Same heights, everyone can reach. Also, everyone can have an apple, not taking apples away from anyone. That's a deep revelation. All right. So many of us see that there's some barriers that still exist in this one, but there's some equity approaches that are allowing folks to have access to the things that they need to be successful. All right. This last picture, what do you notice about this one? I agree, Allison. I like Angel's um, statement about the prior one with the noticing that structural barriers still remained in that middle image. So what are we noticing about this last image? The structural barriers have been removed. Yay, yay, yay. Justice changed the system, the ground, so that everyone can have access. Awesome. The environment changed. All right. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on these images. And I agree with all of the responses that we've shared here. It would be great if we lived in a world free of barriers. But that more perfect society is not yet our reality. Inequities do exist. I'm going to share a few in the STEM workforce, and we'll use some of these to start thinking through um, elements that you may want to include in your diversity statements as you're thinking through um, strategies, action plans, commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion within the context that you're working in. All right. So this slide depicts workers in the science and engineering workforce, comparing the U.S. population to ethnic occupations. Looking at diversity hearing, we really help. This helps us to really understand this term underrepresentation. So this data from NSF shows the difference in the demographic makeup of the US population versus that science and engineering workforce by race, ethnicity, and gender. We note that white men, Asian men, and women are represented in the STEM workforce at rates higher than their population. In contrast, Black men and women, Hispanic Latinx men and women, and other groups, including Native American and white women, are underrepresented in the STEM workforce comparable to their representation in the US population. So when we hear this term underrepresentation, this is what's being discussed. I recognize that there's been a lot of discussion around moving away from the term underrepresentation because it can be stigmatizing to students who minoritized group. And in some ways, I agree with the sentiment, but I have some concerns about discontinuing its use because the movement from the use of this term assumes that there still are some deficits in the individuals that are alone the reason for their underrepresentation. I don't necessarily follow that logic because of some of the conversations that we've already had about inequities in the system. I think that there are other things that are at play, including systemic inequities in our education system. And so, if we don't talk about the underrepresentation and we don't talk about the system, then I think that we're missing part of the boat, and it puts us in another position for translating this conversation in ways that are not necessarily helpful. But I think an informed conversation around underrepresentation, what that means, and how the system should be reformed so that we have justice and we have the removal of structural barriers would be really important for advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion. So here I share some examples of systemic inequities in U.S. Higher education and really in U.S. education, right? So when we say systemic inequities, what do we mean? And this is just a core definition at the top. It's policies and practices that disproportionately has a negative impact on different populations of individuals or on people, right? So it can be intentional, it can be unintentional. Doesn't matter what the intention is. The challenge is what is the outcome. So this disproportionate negative impact are some of the things that we would want to be able to address. So with standardized exams, um, this is just one example of a type of systemic inequity. So numerous studies have shown that these are often a proxy for socioeconomic status, with zip codes being a predictor of test performance. And so in this way, these exams can limit access to higher education and are not representative of actual talent, right? So if the standardized exam is a proxy for status, and zip codes can predict performance, you can have a student with tons of talent, but poor preparation that the standardized exams do not really adequately position for success in our system. All right, public education, particularly secondary public education, is funded by local tax bases. And within this example, what we note is that these local tax dollars that are being used to fund secondary education have clear economic disparities that impact educational preparation. Redlining was a legal process for codifying housing segregation and influencing lending practices that resulted in socioeconomic inequities. These practices impacted schools, nutrition and food availability through nutrition deserts or food deserts in low income communities. Underfunded schools in low income areas disproportionately impacted high numbers of racial and ethnic groups who are also underrepresented in STEM. There's this additional example of students from higher socioeconomic classing having and being more likely to have access to higher level math classes in high school than students with lower socioeconomic statuses. And that ends up impacting where students place into calculus when they come into an undergraduate program, whether or not they have the solid um, preparation to be really successful, or whether or not they need different types of supports when they enter into the system, not because of a lack of talent, but because of disparities in preparation. So, how do we think about these things becomes really important, right? And then not only that, but how do we bring that into faculty work? So these are these huge system issues, but how do we address this in some of the faculty work, which is primarily focused on, again, research, teaching, and service. So when we start to think about your diversity statement, how do we move from those systemic inequities to the loci of control that you all would have in the positions that you are in, to develop a diversity statement and really a plan of action responsive to your locale of control to promote change. All right. And so, to help us to start to think through that, I have a couple of case studies that I'd like to share with you all. So, here's the first one, and I'll read it out loud. So, last summer, I worked with a fantastic undergraduate mentee. She was very intelligent and generated a fair amount of data that was very useful for research in the group. I think she had a positive research experience, but there are still a few questions that linger in my mind. This particular mentee was an African American woman from a small town. I always wondered how she felt on the campus of a large urban research university. I also wondered how she felt about being the only African American woman in our lab. In fact, she was the only African American woman in our entire department that summer. I wanted to ask her how she felt, but I worried that it might be insensitive or politically incorrect to do so. So I never asked. I still wonder how she felt and how those feelings may have affected her experience. What kinds of issues does this case raise? What is the role of the mentor in dealing with these types of issues? What should the research mentor have done in this situation? And what might have been some of the consequences of each of those responses? In so many ways, we bring our whole selves to the work that we do, but there are pieces of us that feel really comfortable with talking about race, and there are pieces of us that just, it's not always the most comfortable conversation. And so, during thinking through the diversity approaches, thinking through your mentoring approach, thinking through your mentoring philosophy, how do you normalize these conversations? How do you normalize within your practice how you cultivate talent and do so with intellectual humility, but also an openness to not be perfect and to be willing to make mistakes is something I think is really core to this process. Faculty have a lot of power in mentor protege relationships. They have a lot of power in defining how their research groups function. How do you integrate DEI values into the leadership and mentorship of your research group is very much in your locus of control. And this is an element that could be featured in your diversity statement. Okay. I have another case study that I'd like to share with you all. Dan Riley entered his chemistry discussion class with his ASL interpreter, Jane. Dan was a bright student, but he was frustrated by his lack of communication with the other students. Today, the TA announced that the first group to solve the challenge problem would have 5 points of extra credit. The group around Dan turned to each other and began trying to solve the problem, ignoring Dan. Jane, who didn't know the sign for acetylene or polyacetylene, began spelling out the names of the polymers. In frustration, Dan walked back to his desk and opened his own textbook. He took out a pen and paper. He looked closely at the textbook description of addition polymerization and worked through the problem. The solution became obvious. As Dan and Jane walked back to the group, there was a commotion at the front of the room. Another group had won. Within this case study, what kinds of issues does this raise? How do we think about sense of belonging in these types of spaces, both within the research space that we spoke of with the last case study and this one? What's the instructor's role in dealing with some of these issues? What could or what should the instructor have done in this situation? What might be the consequences for any of those types of actions or reactions? I remind us again that we bring our whole selves to this work, and faculty have a lot of power in the classroom. How do you integrate DEI values into your teaching and pedagogical approaches is very much in your locus of control. And this is another element that could be featured in your diversity statements. There are any number of phenomenon um, that impact the work that we do and really impact diversity and inclusion. Hypervisibility, invisibility, and isolation is one set of phenomenon. This is when an individual is highly visible but not necessarily included, with heightened scrutiny and surveillance, where failures are magnified and individuals lack control on how they're perceived by others. This is the case of where you're there and you're seen, but not necessarily included, or you're there and you're seen, and normative mistakes are, um, you pay a much higher price. There's a much higher cost associated with just the learning process, the exposure process, the growing process than what others experience. Implicit and unconscious bias. These are learned stereotypes that are automatic, unintentional, unintentional. And I say that multiple times because often when we hear the word bias, and particularly implicit or unconscious bias, we're immediately wanting to say we don't have that, and yet everyone has it because it's unintentional and it's unconscious. These are deeply ingrained, universal biases that are able to influence our behaviors in ways which may run completely counter to, and often do run completely counter to our conscious intentions. Imposter syndrome. Is a condition in which one doubts one's accomplishment and have a persistent fear of being exposed as a fraud. The majoritarian narrative, and these are narratives and beliefs of the majority or in group, and these beliefs dominate perspectives and norms. A sample manifestation of this is the belief in meritocracy, that everyone has the same opportunities to be successful in life, when in fact there are different barriers that folks experience and are navigating. Doesn't mean that they can't overcome those barriers, but the denial of said barriers are in and of itself quite debilitating and challenging. Microaggressions, these are verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, and insults, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, negative messages to targeted persons solely based upon their marginalized group membership. What's impactful about microaggressions is that there are times when these instances are intentional, but there are times when they're very much unintentional. And those unintentional versions still have the same negative impacts um, as those intentional ones. And so being intentional about thinking through how we foster environments where we reduce microaggressions is really impactful. Okay. And so then stereotype threat. These are reactions to low expectations of others that lead to performance levels that would typically be higher without the experiences or cues to low expectations. And so this adds additional stress that impacts the way in which individuals perform. Now, these are not the only phenomenon that impact diversity and inclusion. These are some sample ones, but you can think through with your diversity statements how you might address some of these types of phenomena in thinking through your strategies for mentoring students, or thinking through your strategies for fostering a more inclusive learning environment that promotes sense of belonging amongst all individuals within your group or within your purview or within your literally your locus of control. So your understanding of these impacts, these phenomena can impact diversity and inclusion. And you can integrate these pieces into your plans for research, teaching, and service that you highlight within your diversity statements. So here are a list of bias concepts and definitions. And these are featured in the CBE Life Sciences Education article. We all have biases. Many of these are unconscious and really are a result of our brain being incredibly efficient at processing information. A lot of this processing goes on in the background. And so bringing awareness to our biases and the different ways in which these biases may manifest themselves helps us to make unconscious thinking much more conscious. And that better positions us to integrate DEI into our decision making. So I don't have time to go through all of these, but I encourage you to look at this article and reflect on how you would integrate bias reduction and DEI consciousness into your decision making processes. All right. So finally, I have a set of questions that could be useful in guiding your writing. These questions are particularly useful for helping you to consider how you want to integrate DEI into your classroom and your research spaces. So I'll start with the first one. And you can think about the case studies, and then you can think about any number of other experiences that you have had, either as a mentor, a protege, or an observer of these interactions with others. What is your mentoring philosophy? What is your teaching philosophy? And is DIR integrated into these philosophies? If so, how? I've heard any number of faculty members concerned about um, targeting an individual from a underrepresented, marginalized, minoritized group and making them feel self-conscious about their identities. And one of the things that I would ask you to think about and think about how you would integrate even within your DEI statement is what's normative practice in your group? Are you focused on cultivation of talent in such a way that that conversation that you would have with a student from a minoritized group is different than the conversation you would have from a student from a majority group? If the conversations and the way in which you're approaching mentoring or approaching teaching is seamless and humanistic and really focused on these individuals' development, then the conversation and the kinds of questions you would ask the student from the minoritized group isn't any different than what you would ask from the other group, but the impact could certainly be different. So, what is your normative practice, and how are you thinking through, in an inclusive way, the integration of practices that benefit all your students, but may disproportionately be that extra box, that extra support that's positively impacting that student from a minoritized population? How do you plan to serve a student body that is diverse in a multitude of ways, not thinking just about race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status, but also age, religion, academic preparedness, ability or disability, gender expression, and other differences? Are you really using universal design in your instructional approaches? How do you, as a teacher, create a welcoming and inclusive atmosphere? How do you ensure the students in your class, your lab, the professional spaces that you are leading feel a sense of belonging? How are students acclimated in your discipline, in your research group? Within that research group or within that smaller group that you have a whole lot of leadership and control over, what are the responsibilities of the members of that group? How are new members expected to interact with more senior members of the group? What are proper channels of communication? What are your expectations? How are these conveyed? How are challenging dynamics navigated? What's the first point of communication? What's the level of professionalism that's expected from each other within a group? What are the ethics that you're expecting from members of your group? And do you expect the students are picking this up by osmosis, with a whole lot of ambiguity, or is there directional, intentional approaches that you're using for this? I hear any number of dynamics between graduate students and PIs that blow up over time because of miscommunications, misunderstandings, misinterpretations, and a host of other things that just grow. Authorship on papers, visibility and credit for work that gets completed, and a host of other kinds of things, which innocently is could be misappropriated, right? But that blow up in weird ways, in which disproportionately, systematically impacts individuals from um, minoritized groups and who are in differential power relationships within these environments. How do you promote professionalism and ethics in your classrooms and research spaces? How are more advanced undergraduates and graduate students and postdoc members of your group developed as mentors themselves? How do you integrate your values into your diversity action plan, which basically is your diversity statement? And in STEM disciplines in particular, how is diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and respect represented in the broader impacts of your scholarship teaching service? How is your diversity plan, or how is your diversity statement aligned with your broader impacts mission and activities and represented therein? So you don't have to answer each of these questions to have a memorable or an impactful diversity statement. What I would do is to think about some of the questions that I've shared within this presentation, and even ones that pop up as you reflect on some of these questions. Think about a couple of them, particularly those that resonate with you, and build your diversity statement around an approach that dovetails with your values in these areas that resonate with you, and these areas in which you have prior experience, or the areas in which you want to build experience. It's not that you have to have completely arrived to the destination, but the intentionality with these statements is that you have a plan to grow. You are building upon your past experiences, and that you share what your level of commitment and interest is in engaging in these spaces and in these areas. So I'll share here that actions speak a whole lot louder than words. So diversity statements with tons of flowery and fluffy text and no plans of action for integration within your research, teaching, and service are just fundamentally weak. And um, I think that the majority of the individuals in our space span the STEM disciplines. That's not really a part of what we do in STEM for the most part. So I would focus on having really concrete strategies and thinking about how these integrate in with the normative components of your work. For this, I'm sharing research, teaching, and service as normally components of faculty work. But if your work centered on other areas, I would think about how you are integrating some of these ideas, answering some of these questions within the context of that work, right? Building on the actions that you've actually participated in, or plans of actions that are informed by lessons learned, literature that you've read, all of these things and points of nature. So, what do you need to avoid when you are developing these um, diversity statements. So the first one that you want to avoid is what we call diversity by proxy. And this is relying on numbers or institutional data with actually describing yourselves and your own work. So this looks like this kind of statement. We do really well with diversity in our institution. Some of our students have gone on to graduate school, very good graduate schools, and they're doing fantastic. You haven't told us anything about what you're doing. And that is subterfuge. And when you have someone who's very much interested in understanding how you're going to contribute, it's not clear what your contributions are going to be. Beware of sharing personal stories of redemption, where the focus is on your feelings of empathy for people of color or individuals from minoritized groups or marginalized groups without addressing personal actions within your spheres of influence and power. It is absolutely amazing to be inspired by a lived experience, a reflection, a recognition of challenges, barriers that you see others are navigating and overcoming. And yet, the question is with the diversity statements, what is your commitment to contributing going forward? Right? And so, if it's about what your commitment is, sharing a personal story is useful, but then that needs to be followed up with your plan of action for moving forward. Another thing to be careful of is sharing personal stories of redemption as a example, and then partnering that with an exceptionalism argument, which is basically a deflection which says that only certain people in certain positions have the authority to contribute to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So if I were in a leadership position, I would make decisions that would do this. And the reality of it is that we have locus of control in whatever we're doing. In the two case studies I shared, there was a locus of control within a research group. And in the secondary one, there was a locus of control within a classroom. And in your lived experiences, there are locus of controls that span so many different gamuts. Like these are just two case studies that are just brief summaries of ways in which you can start to think through within the areas of your leadership how you can integrate DEI or be responsive to DEI context. So these exceptionalism arguments, be careful of those. Instead, think through based upon where you are and where you're interested in going, what kinds of plans would you like to develop and what builds on the experiences that you've already had. Be careful of inauthentic statements. Herein, I ask you to tell your own story. Your story, in and of itself, is a wonderful story to be told. Use resources, but resist telling other people's stories or being inauthentic. If you don't have experience in an area, say that. Say that this is an area of growth for me. One of the things I do as an academic leader is to often share with my students when I believe I have a bias and when I believe that I have an area of growth. Because there are tons of ways in which I'm absolutely fantastically wonderful. And those things show up, right? And so my being imperfect is an opportunity to allow other people to grow, to not experience hypervisibility with things, or have negative impacts from making mistakes. It's okay not to be perfect, but it is not okay not to opt to move towards a new place. And so the inauthentic statements, this gives you an opportunity, not doing this gives you an opportunity to be vulnerable, but also to share what your passion is and your commitment for doing something new, if this is not something that you have a whole lot of experience in. And demonstrate that you have a growth mindset. How about that? All right. And then a last thing to resist is feeling like you have to be a superhero. You do not need to be incredibly broad. For so many of you all, this is not your area of study. You are working in chemistry, public health, education, biology, physics, and all of those wonderful areas that we shared at the very beginning. That's where you will spend most of your time living, moving, breathing, and doing stuff. And so, in your diversity statement, you do not need to sound like you are a superhero that's going to solve all the world's problems. Instead, you need to tailor your messaging to manageable approaches that dovetails and builds on some of the areas of your experience, your expertise, and ways in which you want to grow. If you've had students who work with you as undergraduates or high school students, and you've been mentoring them and you're wanting to build upon that to integrate new DEI approaches, and that's going to be a component of your DEI statement, that's powerful, right? Because it builds on and it grows from where you've been. That's reasonable. But don't try to be a superhero with all of this because that's going to appear to be inauthentic. And the reality of it is that it's unlikely that you're going to be able to do that. So what um is this a moment of where you're exhibiting that you lack integrity in actually pursuing the things that you say you want to pursue? So make it manageable and make it build off of things that you have been successful with in the past or that you're learning through right now. You have the opportunity to highlight your experience with justice, equity, equality, diversity, inclusion, and respect through your diversity statement. So for this, begin to really take stock of the experiences that you've had, considering some of these potential avenues through which you've engaged in this type of work. What kinds of service experiences have you had with students from underrepresented groups or just underrepresented groups in general? This could include outreach, tutoring, and other types of programs that have had topics that are relevant to women, minorities, veterans, people with disabilities, and other groups. This could have been committee work. This could have been some affinity groups or something of the like. Think about your experiences in teaching, advising, or mentoring underrepresented groups or students from underserved groups. Students who are from very poor families and low income families. What have you done with some of those individuals, and how does that inform the ways in which you're going to um, integrate these concepts into your teaching, advising, and mentoring going forward? Teaching approaches that focus on different learning styles and how you are accommodating different learning abilities. What are you using in terms of universal design with your instruction? Being aware of challenges faced by historically underrepresented populations and thinking through how your strategies that are in your diversity action plan through your diversity statement are being responsive to some of those challenges. What's been some of your community involvement within the university and beyond the institution? Do you have any research activities that are specifically contributing to diversity, equity, and inclusion? This could be things like environmental justice or dealing with health inequities or any number of similar types of things. And are there any future activities that you might pursue in the context of how they fit into your research area, department, the campus, or in this national context? Thinking through any ongoing initiatives that are particularly relevant to you. What are some of the things in your professional societies that you might have gotten involved in, and how some of that gets represented and can be represented as a component of your diversity statement? And for those who are working in science, particularly in work funded by the National Science Foundation, how does your work in broader impacts, how can that be informed, tied to your diversity statement? Is it seamless? And can you make it clear to folks who are reading your diversity statements and really trying to understand more about your commitment to these efforts, that they can see how all of that dovetails and makes for a cohesive plan for who you would be as a faculty member, or how you would be as a contributor or leader within their unit. All right. So we're going to open this up for questions, but before we ask you about your questions, I believe my colleagues have some questions for you all.
Yep, so we're going to go ahead and launch a poll. And the first question that we have for you all is, are you interested in a more in-depth writing workshop where you would bring a draft of your diversity statement and then workshop it during the session? So I'm going to launch that poll now. All right, so it looks like we've got quite a few people who are interested in that. That's great. Okay. So yes, it looks like this is something that we can offer because we got a lot of interest here. So I'm going to end the poll, and I have a second poll with some potential dates that folks might be available to do this. So I guess y'all can't see the results, can you? Okay, so those are the results there. So we got a lot of folks interested, 89%. And then my second poll, if I can get to it. Here we go. Okay. We have some dates coming up, December 6th and December 8th. Now I know, though, that's pretty soon, and I know December is a busy time. So we can certainly look at pushing this to next spring, but if folks are available on these dates, we can schedule something for December 6th or December 8th. Okay, so I'm seeing it is pretty evenly split right now between those two dates. So we'll let folks finish answering the poll, and then we will take that information into account, and I will send out an email, a follow-up email. I'll let you all know when the slides from today's session are posted, and this video will be up on our YouTube channel. So I'll send out that link, and then I will also send out information about a more in-depth workshop session and when we will hold that. So thank you all.
Okay. So one of the things that we wanted to do with this first session was to send out and provide for you all some context for thinking through how to craft your statement, giving you guiding questions, laying out some systemic challenges in higher education and things that have led to inequities, so that you can start to think through what elements that you would want to address. What you need to think about is what's authentically you and what really resonates with you, because it's impossible to hit every single thing for every single population. So what I think makes a diversity statement really impactful is for you to take these questions, think through what resonates with you, and then start with your core definition. What are some of your prior experience? What's your passion about related to these things? And then who do you want to target based upon how it dovetails with your job function, with the areas in which you have locus of control and leadership, and then use some of the literature. And I'm about to share a slide with some literature. Think thinking through some of these elements to guide your planned approach. Generally, you will have between a page to 2 pages to highlight um, your plans for diversity. And there certainly are some resources for writing diversity statement. But what's equally important is some of the literature um, focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, and STEM. And again, this list is not exhaustive. This is just a list of some curated samples of things to think about. But going into the literature, thinking through what resonates with you, and coming up with a plan that shares these are some of the areas of my focus, and this is my commitment to this work. That those are the kinds of things that make for really powerful diversity statements, that makes for memorable diversity statements that are then tied in ways that I think many scientists can grapple, can understand, and can see how that would position you for any of the ongoing work that may be happening in their units or any of the aspirational work that they have for their units. And so in our next session, what we will do is give you all an opportunity to process some of this information, um, bring with you drafts of the diversity statements you all already have, and us talk through, do reviews of those critiques, and really help refine some of the approaches that you all share within the statements that you all have created. So with this, I'll open it up for questions. Okay, if there are no questions at this point, then what I'm probably going to do, because I'm seeing the scheduling, Rob, I'll go and do both days.
Okay. Yep.
Um, I'll go on ahead and do both days since we're evenly split just about. Because I'd rather have folks who are interested have that opportunity for engagement than for them not to be able to have that. So we'll do both of those days.
Great. That sounds great. So I will go ahead and send out an email to you all. I know next week is Thanksgiving week, so I'll send out something probably early next week and then the week afterwards as well. And you'll be able to register for either of those 2 days, December 6th or December 8th. It looks like we do have a question in the chat from Laura Livingston. And she is saying, when a post asks for evidence of JEDI-R in research, teaching, and service in one page, how would you balance meeting their expectations while telling concrete, authentic stories for each component? That's a good question.
That is a very good question. So I would write out a longer statement and then condense it down. So it's really hard to write concrete, not concrete. It's very hard to write concise statements um, from the jump start. It's just hard, right? So I would write out your longer story and then work on distilling it down um, for brevity. I often think about what are the big components. So research and teaching in some institutions carry a little bit more weight than service does. In other institutions, service can be a bigger component. So I would let the institutional mission guide the way in which I divvy up real estate in that document, right? So if you were at a research one institution, I would probably overrepresent the integration and evidence and research and potentially teaching than I would for service. I would probably do a very short synopsis for service in that case. If I were in a primarily teaching institution, primarily undergraduate institution, I would flip that and do more space. I would dedicate more real estate to the teaching piece and maybe the service piece, unless there's a huge undergraduate research component, in which case I would do teaching first and then um, um, the research piece. I'm sorry, I'm reading Allison's statement right after that and trying to process both of those. Um, no worries. Um, it's the joys of Zoom in the chat box. And so I hope that answers portions of your question. Laura, I do think that there are some challenges there, but don't feel like you have to tell a complete full story for all of those elements. Prioritize based upon institutional mission and the focus of that position, and then tell smaller stories for the pieces that are um, less aligned with mission and what the primary focus of the positions would be. So Allison, not a question, submitted a diversity statement before, felt random and unfocused, and this has been helpful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think a lot of things we think about the diversity piece as just the humanistic piece, and I think that's a part of it. But we work in a world with scientists, and we tend not to be touchy feely. So you got to figure out how to bridge the touchy feely pieces, which are really important to the human experience and the environment that you want to cultivate, with specific, in the words of NIH, aims or objectives, speaking in NSF terms. So you really have to take it from this large piece. So going through and thinking through your fluffy parts, like the really humanistic parts, but then taking that down and distilling that down into strategic ways in which you're going to do A, B, C, D, and what's the rationale, and do you have evidence to suggest, I mean, to support the reasons for that? What have you found in the literature? Can you cite some papers that suggest this is the approach that you're using and why? Can we do both sides of that? I think that helps out with making this um, meet the intentions of a commitment to diversity and inclusion, but then making it something that's nitty and gritty, strategic, and um, really set up to have potential for success, because you really have a game plan. We're not just talking about the touchy feely pieces, which inspire us, but then we got a game plan for this is how we want to actually operationalize it. All right. Well, I don't believe in keeping us for beyond. I thought I was going to talk a little bit more in some of those other sessions, but I got through with it faster than I thought. And so, what we will do in that next session is really go through um, some of these other pieces. I see this message from Nicholas, who is interested in going straight into some academic fields of diversity and inclusion. So that was my pathway. I am a chemist by training. My PhD is in inorganic chemistry. I did DFT calculations on organometallic systems. But during that time, I also was very involved with my Novache chapter, and in developing a tutoring program in a local organization, which really helped me to think through how I wanted to do work in broadening participation, Nicholas. And so a lot of that is components of what led me down the pathway to where I am right now. Um, and the advice that I would give for you all who are interested in going into academic fields of diversity and inclusion, who have a background in STEM, is to understand that some of the same types of things that you have to do to be successful in the traditional pathways are the same things you have to do in academic STEM. I still have to write grants. I still have to do presentations. I still have to have my work um, focused on using literature and evidence. I still have to write papers. I still have to build connections. Um, because you need to have rigor in the work that you're doing, regardless of what that area is. If you're in higher ed, um, and if you're working in any kind of academic space that's like this, you're not really going to get away from those pieces. And so it becomes building up a different type of skill set, which is awesome for you to do, because if you've been able to get through a STEM PhD, you can do a lot of things. You have transferable skills. And so thinking through what that needs to look like and how you gain other skills and disciplines that you don't currently have skill sets in reviewing and looking at some of the sociology research and thinking through some of the education pieces. All of those are important things. I feel like that needs to be another talk, because I'm summarizing in a brief statement a whole bunch of stuff. And it may be that as a component of the alternative career sessions, that Rob and Christian and I can think about not just my experiences, but some experiences of others in alternative careers that could help inform the transition to diversity and inclusion and other types of transitions that you all as graduate students are thinking about. And if there's interest in that, I'm pretty sure we can figure out how to make that happen.
Yes, I think we absolutely can. So I think that's a great suggestion.
See, Nicholas, you've given us a new talk idea. How about that? That's leadership, Nicholas. You're leading today.
All right. Well, if there's no other questions, I have one final ask of you all, and that is if you could take our brief evaluation survey, and I'm going to put the link in the chat. Let us know how we did. And then I'm going to share my screen one more time. If you're interested in learning more about us, you can visit our website at lspacmodels.org. And our email address is info@lspacmodels.org if you have any questions. So we thank you all very much for being with us this afternoon. We hope you found this session useful. I certainly did. And we will be sending out more information about the upcoming workshops, as well as information about when this recording will be posted publicly on our YouTube page. So thank you all again, and I hope you all have a great weekend and a great Thanksgiving. Take care.